Back. Today we are on to lesson 12, dictatorships. And in this lesson on authoritarianism and dictatorships, after the lesson, we're hoping that you'll have a better understanding of the concepts of authoritarianism and the related idea of dictatorships. We'd like you to be able to identify some of the reasons and historical figures that have often been referenced to justify authoritarianism. We'd like you to be able to outline some of the principal techniques that are used by these dictators, and finally connect the idea of authoritarianism and dictatorship to a resistance or an antithesis to liberalism. So in this document we have lots of different avenues to go down. Always the first one is to see what Williams has said on the topic, and that is meant to be done already, so I put this link right at the top of the document. So if you haven't watched the Williams video, please go back and take care of that first thing. Assuming that you've done that now, we are going to look just kind of big picture at the concept of dictatorships today in 2020. And in order to do that, we have this map here that shows, what countries are mostly free. And I know it says free, but I'm going to say mostly free. And then we have some that are partially free, which would be less free. And then the dictatorships shown in red would be the most controlled political systems in the world. Now, the nice thing about this hyperlink is if you go down this rabbit hole, there's a website that gives you a whole list of current dictators, and then you can look at them into greater detail. Now, you're probably asking me, and you should be asking me, Mr. McBride, I don't think I'm going to move to Belarus. Under what circumstances would I need to know about the Belarusian president? Well, definitely you're not going to hear about Belarus on the multiple choice. But when you write an essay and you're talking about authoritarianism, most students in the province will talk about Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, and you need to as well. Those are the blue chip standards that, there's a reason why everyone's referencing them, is because they are a great fit. But in order to really unpack the significance of authoritarianism, we need to be able to have a conversation about the reality that much of the world is still subject to dictatorships, and being able to highlight that by having a very specific contemporary case study would be definitely to your benefit. It would make it look more precise, more sophisticated, more insightful, and really has that opportunity to make you stand out. So that's why you might want to go down that rabbit hole. Another nuance to this idea of authoritarianism is that authoritarianism is on the rise in those areas shown above in yellow. And that's why I said mostly free, because even in countries like the United States that were based upon and built on a foundation of liberty, there is within that liberal democracy a rise of authoritarianism today that some are suggesting we could call Trumpism. So there's an 8-minute discussion video there for you to look at if you would like to explore the idea that authoritarianism is and has not been defeated, and in fact is beginning to show signs of a reemergence in countries like America with Trumpism. And we're seeing it with Brexit in the UK, and we're seeing it with the rise of fascist parties elsewhere. I do have some prezzies for you. I have many prezzies for you. And here we have a Prezi on the types of authoritarianism. So the purpose of this Prezi is to help with, Chapter 5. They do talk about authoritarianism in the textbook. And they also talk about authoritarianism at the end of Chapter 10. And they introduce some general types of authoritarianism. This is a Prezi that maybe you look at one time. So it's going to define what authoritarianism is. That's straight out of the textbook. So nothing too earth-shattering there. But then it's also going to, like the textbook does, it's going to tell you about some examples from history. So oligarchies. We have an example of what some would say would be a form of elitism. This cartoon is showing the power should rest with the masses at the bottom, but the masses at the bottom are only there to sustain the lifestyle of the few at the top. Very feudalistic, very pseudo or neo-feudalistic. So modern form of oligarchy could be seen in South Africa during the 20th century under apartheid, rule by a few, where a minority of the people have, freedom, but in this case, a majority of the people did not. We also have one-party states, a political system where, nice spelling, only one party forms the government and no other parties are permitted to run. So you have one-party states where it becomes a de facto dictatorship if the leader of that one party is unquestioned. So after the Enabling Act, Adolf Hitler was able to manipulate the Reichstag into dismissing the other parties, rule by decree for 5 years, and ended up changing it into a dictatorship. So to what extent does Alberta provincially resemble a one-party state? Now, I made this Prezi years ago, and at that time, the provincial Progressive Conservative Party had decades in power since the early 1970s. But since then, we have had the NDP be the provincial government, and now we have the UCP, which is a new party that has formed government. So that is no longer as relevant as it once was. So then it goes into the Alberta government a little bit there. We also have military dictatorships. It's when the military rolls the tanks in and creates a coup, and the legitimacy for their rule is the military might. Here's Boris Yeltsin in 1991 jumping on those tanks in Moscow, challenging the would-be August coup that was trying to topple the reform movement of Mikhail Gorbachev and stop what ended up being the breakaway republics, including his Republic of Russia, from breaking away. So, just some things to think about in terms of types of authoritarian states. We also have another Prezi here that looks at historical comparison of some key authoritarian leaders. So, if your knowledge coming out of Social 20 of leaders like Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin remains quite limited, then we have a comparison. Now, this one is maybe most desirable for those of you that love English and maybe don't love social studies. So what we've done here is we've taken the Shakespeare story Macbeth and compared some of the characterization within that to some of the philosophy behind authoritarianism and also to some leaders today. So Machiavelli famously would maybe support some of the ideas that authoritarian leaders would have. For example, Joseph Stalin in the 1930s recognized that the USSR was 50 to 100 years behind the great powers of the world. If they didn't make good that lag in 10 years, they'd be crushed. And because that end was important, the survival of the USSR, the means, the techniques that Stalin would end up using in a very Machiavellian way may appear to be justifiable. So definitely there's some comparisons that are going to be made here. And if that intrigues you, then I would say jump on in. Next up, one of the things we really want you to be able to leave here with today is an understanding of, under what circumstances would people support authoritarianism. Even if you end up writing an essay where you support democracies instead of authoritarianism, it's going to be important for you to unpack the division of society, that conversation. It's important for you to understand the multiplicity of opinions and attitudes surrounding, what is the best form of government. And therefore, even if you're not going to be defending authoritarianism, it's important to be able to acknowledge how others might do so. So we need to hypothesize for a moment. Hypothesize why authoritarianism might become attractive. What flaws in political liberalism might inspire someone to turn to authoritarianism? The main alternative to authoritarianism, liberal democracies, many might see as weak, as being inefficient, and therefore, in order to achieve the full potential of a nation, we need powerful leaders. The fragility of modern regimes is evidenced in their futile attempts to control and shape the growth of society by restricting internet usage, banning demonstrations and the right of association, or controlling judges. So when democracies begin to behave like authoritarian states, we see just how fragile these modern liberal regimes are. And when we have this collective desire for our nation to be promoted, when we want to see glory for our nation, under those circumstances, we may be willing to sacrifice some of our individualism. We do have some key historical figures who have defended authoritarianism. Hobbes would be one we've explored before. There's a Prezi on Hobbes, and there'll be a link to that video again later. For as long as every man holdeth this right of doing anything he liketh, so long are all men in the condition of war. I love the Old English there and how they spell things, but that's that idea that in nature, when man is free, when we have our natural liberty, man is also in a constant state of war. So in freedom, there's insecurity. In freedom, there's danger, and that's why we sacrifice some of that freedom, some of that liberty to a Leviathan, because we crave security more than we want our own liberty. In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use the commodities that may be imported by sea, no building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require more force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear, and danger of violent death. And the life of man will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So that's the quote by Hobbes that has really been used as a linchpin in the argument that we need authoritarianism, because without authoritarianism we can't accomplish great things, because we'll be constantly being held back by our fear of each other's freedom. Freedom breeds fear because it allows us to be a threat to each other. So if you need more information about Hobbes, because Hobbes is in terms of this concept of authoritarianism, he's the principal philosopher that we're looking at. Here's another Prezi for you. So Thomas Hobbes. Now, once again, with these Prezis, there's often extraneous information. So there's some stuff here that you could probably skip. We don't really need to know that he completed his education at Oxford, but great on him. But what we want to do is to figure out, what complaint does he have with liberty, and what is his solution? And for him, it goes back to the nature of man and our natural ability to do evil upon each other, and therefore the need for someone to control our nature. That state of competition. Competition isn't a good thing. For individuals like Adam Smith, he sees competition as the reason why capitalism will work. Competition, the invisible hand, will force us to find our niche. But for Hobbes, competition will lead to that state of war that will make our lives nasty, brutish, and short. So, if you need to know more about Thomas Hobbes, we have that rabbit hole to fall down. There's the Hobbes video that you can jump into again. Now, just as an update, the term Leviathan today is used differently than it might have been used by Hobbes. When Hobbes was referring to Leviathan, he wasn't necessarily saying a benevolent or a malevolent leader. He was just saying a Leviathan as an all-powerful leader. Today, when we see Leviathan, often it talks about a bloated state monster that spreads its tentacles into all parts of society. So Leviathan today might look more like Big Brother of 1984 in this practice of statism. I'm not saying that there's a huge disconnect between the two interpretations, but when Hobbes was talking about a Leviathan, he wasn't necessarily talking about, you know, a state. He was talking more about a Leviathan, a leader. So we have other individuals, philosophers, that would also support authoritarianism. We have a link to a video on Machiavelli and the ends justify the means. We have Nietzsche and his idea of Superman, and we also have Carlyle and his great man theory. Now, all of these can be used at a theoretical level to defend authoritarianism. Why is it that we should promote the interests of some at the expense of others? You know, what is it in even a Plato philosopher king sense? You know, why should some rule and others should not? And that question will be answered by these individuals. So these are short videos. Each one's about 6 minutes long. Definitely good for you to watch to, you know, get from an S to a PF. You know, if your goal is to be more than generalized, then we must be able to talk about Machiavelli, the ends justify the means, or the great man theory of Nietzsche, or sorry, of Carlyle, and the Superman concept of Nietzsche. This idea that society is propelled by the few. There's a quote by Adolf Hitler here that kind of captures that same essence. Although we cannot be too sharp in condemning the absurd notion that geniuses can be born from general elections. In the first place, a nation only produces a real statesman once in a blue moon, and not 100 or more at once. And in the second place, the revulsion of the masses for every outstanding genius is positively instinctive. Sooner will a camel pass through a needle's eye than a great man be discovered by an election. In world history, the man who really rises above the norm of the broad average usually announces himself personally. So Adolf Hitler, in his book Mein Kampf, is talking about how democracies don't work. You're not going to have 100 great people all at once chosen by popularity in an election. What we really need, if the the glory of the state, the collective glory is your goal, is to allow, that great man to seize the stage. So, good quote from Hitler to continue that idea. And then there's some arguments against authoritarianism and against dictatorships and revolutions there as well to balance it out. Here's an argument that a lot of would-be dictators that rise to the international scene say, you know what, I am the inevitable, right? And, expressing yourself as the inevitable, some kind of force of nature or a force of history, is a recurring theme with these dictators. Now, we do need to also understand that there have been some dictators in the past that some may be able to look at some of their policies, domestic or foreign, and say, well, look, you accomplished some great things. So we have some quick videos here that look at the benevolence of dictators and some of the accomplishments of them. They're short videos, and it can add to your understanding of the complexity of this idea. So a couple more rabbit holes to look down. There's a lengthy hypothetical article here about the rise of Donald Trump and the idea of populism. Only go down this rabbit hole after you've exhausted yourself with the other links that I've shown you. Here's a cartoon about Trump potentially, being a threat to liberty, and it's only through justice and the court system that we can contain the power and the ambitions of this man. So he has the executive branch of the United States at the time of this recording, but there's many people that after his election in 2016 feared that he would want to challenge the checks and balances and really end up becoming a more authoritarian leader. And in the United States, they have these constitutional checks and balances that can protect the liberty of the U.S. We have some hypothetical case studies about why we should oppose authoritarianism, coming from Macbeth, coming from Margaret Atwood, and also coming from movies like Our Brand is Crisis. Can tyrannies, can dictatorships, can authoritarian states be defeated? Tyrannies can seem to come out of nowhere or with great force, but are equally susceptible to sudden collapse. This is logical, since any form of government that is so fully based on coercion builds up pressures and can ultimately burst out in revolution. In plurality, there is an inherent stability. In authoritarianism states, huge resources must go into maintaining order. Think Winston in 1984, how much the state had to do to continue to keep a citizen obedient. And that's why maybe long-term dictatorships can't work, is because the techniques that they have to use to control the people are not long-term viable. Now, as important as it is to understand authoritarianism, the concept, we very often see the techniques of dictatorship used. Almost on every diploma multiple choice, there'll be some reference to it. And if you have political sources, no doubt there might be some either inference or illustration of these techniques within them. So we are going to spend some time now going down this rabbit hole and looking at the techniques that dictators use to control their people. I'm going to skip the videos because, they're probably dead links anyways by now. But here's a definition of a dictatorship straight out of Wikipedia. A dictatorship is defined as an autocratic form of government in which the government is ruled by an individual, the dictator. It has three possible meanings. It's a little bit of a history lesson behind the term dictator, and coming out of ancient Rome, the idea that if there's an enemy at the gates, we don't have time for some kind of democratic discussion to see what should we do. We need someone to dictate the solution. We need a strong, willful, and determined individual, and that's what dictators are. So an example of a dictator would be Adolf Hitler, would be Mussolini, and we have some quick references to them there. So common techniques, that's the main push here. Common techniques that dictators use. One of them, scapegoating. So for Adolf Hitler, he liked to blame the Jewish people. Why did Germany lose World War I? Well, there must have been a Jewish conspiracy against Germany. When the German economy was struggling in 1933, it must be because the Jewish people were controlling the financial industry of not only Germany, of the world, and they're holding back. There's this great conspiracy against the Germans, holding them back throughout history, and in order to really unlock the full potential of the German nation, they had to ethnically cleanse and ultimately exterminate the Jewish people from the German lands. So in the Bible, a live goat over whose head Aaron confessed all the sins of the children of Israel on the Day of Atonement, the goat symbolically bearing their sins was then sent into the wilderness. This is where the idea of scapegoat comes from, that goat is going to be sacrificed, and with it will go all of those troubles that we are experiencing. So sometimes you need to characterize your opponent so that you can build animosity against them. So you're going to use stereotypes so that you can create division in society. Here the Jewish nation is being shown as, the Jewish people are being shown as this parasite that is sucking the life out of the other German people. And you wouldn't want to coexist in your house with a spider that is a threat to you like that, so why not get rid of that pest? So there will be propaganda, there will be indoctrination, there will be a campaign to win the hearts and minds or poison the hearts and minds of the German people before they can exterminate them. So here you have the German people looking to be quite impoverished at the edge of death because the Jewish people have been benefiting at their expense. So the problem with scapegoats is that when we are not a part of that group, when we allow others to be persecuted, ultimately that persecution can come to us. And that's what this reflection from a very prominent German anti-Nazi theologian and Lutheran pastor. This poem became known as that awakening of why we need to stand up for other people's rights. Because if we don't stand up for them, who's going to stand up for us? Trotsky was one of Stalin's scapegoats. So when things weren't working, even though Trotsky had been exiled, forces of Trotsky must be working against Stalin and his vision for the Soviet Union. So ultimately, even though Trotsky had fled to Mexico, even in Mexico, Trotsky still remained a threat to Stalin, and therefore Stalin had him executed. Indoctrination is another technique of dictators. So sometimes living in a liberal democracy, we get to a point where we can't believe that people can be led into hatred. So there's some very famous experiments done with this, and one of them that you should look into is the Wave from 1981. Here's some more of that indoctrination targeting children. So in Hitler's Germany, there would have been an opportunity when children are learning how to read to really shape what they're reading so that you can shape what kind of conclusions they're making about the world. What kind of values do we want them to have? Well, we want them to discriminate against Jewish people. So we need to link something that they know with something we want them to know. So they know mushrooms can be dangerous. So why not have a story where some of the mushrooms in the story are really Jewish people and they're poisonous, and therefore it's not really safe to have these poisonous mushrooms in our gardens surrounding our homes, so we should probably get rid of them. So it looks like they're learning how to read, but they're really learning how to hate. And this is just a video about the Hitler's youth from the perspective of somebody within. So you can certainly go back, and it's somebody reflecting upon, the intoxicating group identity that the Hitler Youth was, and why they felt that they wanted to join it. Another technique that dictators use is the cult of the leader. We don't question the leader because the leader is all powerful. The leader is godlike. The leader has answers that we don't. The leader is the knight that we've been waiting for. Another technique that dictators use will be mass rallies. They'll use force and terror, secret police. The power of the secret police is amazing. Not only can they demonstrate it in light, but it's the power that they demonstrate when you don't see what they're up to that is also equally effective, right? So sometimes even just the thought of the Gestapo was enough to control others. Yeah, YouTube's great at taking things down. State glory, another technique of dictators. So the glory of Hitler's Germany was on parade at the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936. Sometimes you have to purge or eliminate elements of society that don't fit the vision that you have. We had purges in the French Revolution. We have purges with Adolf Hitler and his night-long knives. And we have purges with Stalin and his great terror and his great purge and his show trials. So purges are a very common technique that dictators use. And the point behind these techniques of dictators is we're hoping that you could write an essay saying that although dictators sometimes have been associated with great accomplishments, the conditions under which citizens within their states must live, i.e. the techniques of dictatorship, make their states less desirable. And the lack of justice, the lack of legality, being sent to prison without a fair trial, gulags, prison camps. These are all the camps in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. Millions of people were put into camps, not out of crimes that they'd committed, but out of a way to control them, state control. And in the Soviet Union, that meant collectivization. And because not everyone wanted their lands to become public property, this led to the liquidation of the kulaks as a class, and at least 6 million Ukrainian kulaks died. Censorship. So Adolf Hitler had a book burning in April of 1933, and this cartoonist is suggesting that Khrushchev and his book burning in 1958 is the equivalent. And anytime that you're being compared to Adolf Hitler, you probably should rethink your policies. First they burn books, and then they burn people. And unfortunately, in Hitler's Germany, that was clear prophecy. All right, so there's some techniques of dictatorship. We use some of them even in liberal societies like scapegoats. Legendary Washington Redskins coach George Allen was a firm believer in keeping open the wounds of unfairness. So he used the phantom catch to continue to rally his troops, and they credited a future Super Bowl win by having the right enemy motivating his team. We also have some little rabbit holes here about the role of the media. And I'd like you to consider the things in green are just things for you to ponder. What is happening today that might further change the relationship between the people, the media, and the government? And the transparency of government through the lens of the media was exposed with the Watergate scandal. And there's a little information there about the Watergate scandal for you. Then we have some notes on non-liberalism and illiberalism, and some notes on the techniques of dictatorship. So by the time you get to this, you should be ready to kind of just read a summary. And after you read the summary, you can join me in our Hangout and see if you have any further questions.